So, hey everybody. This recording, we're going to take a look at Chapter 17 of American Yawp, which is about how the United States is going to conquer the West. And I think there's different angles that we can take on this, but in the big sections that we're looking at here, we've got a few minutes on Western migration, economic expansion, what's going to pull American settlers to move from the East Coast and from the West Coast into the center part of the country. And then the next part, we're talking about the conflicts that are going to happen in the Western Plains between American settlers and Native Americans that have been already forced into this part of the country over previous generations. And then in the last piece of this, we'll get into like the differences that appear with how the West is presented so far as myth, as a great American story, and as how the history of the West might be a little bit more diverse and a little more complicated when you look at it from different perspectives. But first, let's look at this picture that we've got here in the background. So this is a picture taken in 1904, and this is in the American Southwest. And I like the full picture on this because it kind of lays into a little bit of the different realities that go on here. For migration and economic expansion, this doesn't look like an area, and it's really not an area still in 21st century where there's a huge population because the terrain doesn't really lend itself to that. And so when we look at why Americans would go this way, this is a decent picture to keep in mind. It also is kind of a picture that leads to some thought about like the mythology of the West and how this awesome, beautiful terrain, kind of unique terrain, is going to be one of the defining features of how Americans think about themselves. So, I don't know, let's just get straight to it. So for this section, we're going to take a look at the push and pull factors that are going to lead Americans to move towards the Western United States, and specifically look at the economic development that's going to be, in the long run, a significant pull factor. Before we start talking about people, it makes sense to talk about the geography of the West and the Western Plains. In essence, there was a feeling that this part of the United States that we're talking about, really these empty sections here on the map, that this was really considered by a lot of people to be the Great American Desert. The map is showing, so this map is dated to 1860. So you can see areas where Americans had settled by the 1830s and then going up to the outbreak of the Civil War. But out here in the central part of the country, the Great Plains through the Rockies into the Great Basin out here, this is really considered to be a vast desert land where there's not a whole lot of green space, there's not a whole lot of resources that are available, and it really wasn't considered to be all that hospitable to folks wanting to move there and settle. It's kind of dry, arid, empty space. But the one thing that it does have a lot of land, and the land that's available is, with the right kind of irrigation being brought in, it can be usable farmland. And when it comes down to the idea of private property ownership and the fulfillment of the American dream, that attraction to be a farmer or to be able to get some sort of economic prosperity off the land, that's a big draw for people over the course of a couple of generations. We're talking very long term here, from the 1860s going into the 1880s and 90s. During the Civil War, one of the things that's going to help draw more people to this land is going to be the Homestead Act. So during the war, the idea was that any kind of federal land that is available, that a family could get 160 acres for free just by applying to the government and promising to take care of that land for just a few years. During the war, this is really designed to help create some extra farmland to help feed Americans during the war, the Union soldiers and the Union states during the war, because a lot of the farmland in the country was this Confederate Southern farmland, which wasn't really doing much in the way of helping out the Union. So kind of as a wartime effort, but kind of as an effort to increase westward expansion for settlers, this law is going to stick around for decades and decades. And actually, it's going up into the 1970s and 80s that it was still available to people to apply and get some free land from the federal government. Now, when farmers would settle into these areas, like these settlers here in North Dakota, there's not a whole lot out there for them. You might notice that there's no trees anywhere to be seen in this picture, and these Norwegian settlers, immigrant settlers that have moved up into North Dakota, this house is made from sod. You can actually see like grass, and sometimes they've got flowers growing on top of their houses because they're building things based on the only resources they've got available out there. So this is by no means going to be an easy life, and it's not a lot of people that we're talking about moving to the Great Plains, but that process is getting started, here immediately during and after the Civil War, and really going through the next, 25 to 40 years. So we've talked about the importance of the railroads in other parts of this unit, but maybe it is the most important so far as how it leads to increased settlement of the western states. Dating back to the Civil War, there was an effort being made by the federal government to build a transcontinental railroad, a railroad that is going to link the country together from coast to coast in a manifest destiny kind of way. Because I think you know that pre-Civil War, thanks to the California Gold Rush, you've got a population that's built up along the West Coast, but through this central part, this is what we just saw in that previous line, there's not a lot of a population that's through here at all. And the Transcontinental Line is designed to promote this linkage during the Civil War. Even though this is funded during the Civil War, this is going to continue into the late 1860s and the 1870s, and the bulk of this work is going to get done by two railroad companies. There's the Union Pacific, which is on the map here in the blue line, and you might recognize this logo because this is one of the major rail companies that's still around today. But they are going to cover this territory across the Great Plains and ultimately get out here to this point in Utah where they're going to join the rails between the Union Pacific and the other company, which is called the Central Pacific. Both these rail companies are going to use a significant amount of immigrant labor to build these rail lines, in part because immigrants are finding it difficult to get jobs in established cities. So on the West Coast in California, Chinese immigrants are seeing a lot of employment opportunity on the railroad because there's not a lot of opportunity for them in California cities. This is prior to the Chinese Exclusion Act. And in actuality, the conclusion of the Central Pacific line is going to lead to more Chinese immigrants looking for jobs on the California coast, leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. But here in the 1860s and 70s, the work on the railroad is one of the only jobs available to Chinese immigrants. On the Union Pacific line, it's the same kind of story, but it's Irish immigrants, Irish Catholic immigrants that are finding it difficult to get jobs in cities in places like Chicago or back further in cities in the Northeast. With these jobs available and this dangerous work available, ultimately the Union and Central Pacific lines are joined in 1869, but in the long run, going into the 1870s and 80s and up to 1890, like this map shows, the number of railroads linking things to the west are just going to develop on a steady basis, extending coast to coast, not just on a straight east to west line, but connecting the northwest and the southwest and connecting different parts of Texas. And really, by the time you get to 1890, there's this element of interconnectedness in the United States coast to coast that's never really been felt before, just in time for there to be talk about other issues related to the frontier and development of economic issues on a national and international basis. So thanks to the Homestead Act and thanks to the Transcontinental Railroad and the development of railroads overall, there is a developing means to get more and more people moving to the west. On the economic expansion of this, we got to talk just briefly about one more time about like the rise of Chicago as a major American city. You can kind of see from this map, which is put out by the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad Company, one of the many railroad companies that's developing in the late 19th century. Chicago is a hub. Anything in the western United States is going to connect to the eastern U.S. For the most part, Chicago is a central rail depot. It's where the country is going to link together. You can see it a little bit better in this inset map that's down here. The continental line goes all the way through to Chicago, and you can kind of see like the other trunk lines that come out moving to the east to different parts of the East Coast. Chicago is the fastest growing city in the world in the 19th century, and this is going to become a major part of it. One of the other things that makes Chicago was kind of central to the Chicago economy is the rise of the cattle drive and of the cattle industry. Chicago is a center of the meatpacking industry, and it is going to help get, things we take for granted, commercial meats available like in a market. It's going to increase the availability and kind of lower the prices of this and make this available to more people. Now, but the cattle aren't found in Chicago. Instead, they are found further to the south in Texas. And it's the work done by cowboys on the cattle drives, taking Texas Longhorn cattle from points across the central southern plains of Texas and taking them not all the way up to Chicago, but taking up to places like Dodge City or Abilene, Kansas, or Kansas City, Missouri, or St. Louis, Missouri. The cattle drives are literally cowboys herding and escorting, if you will, herds of cattle up to these midwestern cities in Kansas and Missouri, because that's where railheads are. Before you've kind of got any railroad development coming into Texas in the 1870s and 80s, this was an essential part of this economy, and this is going to have an economic pull for more and more Americans seeing an opportunity to move to the West, not just to be in the cattle business, but to take advantage of some of the money that's starting to come through here as American civilization and American society is establishing itself in a new section of the country. By the time you get to the 1880s and 90s, the long drives are starting to fade, not because there wasn't money to be made in the cattle industry anymore, but more so because those rail lines are beginning to get built into Texas by the 1880s and 90s, and so it is now just more lucrative to skip the long drive and either have cattle herds up here in the Great Plains, or you have rail yards down here in Texas that are going to transport the cattle up to places like Chicago for the meatpacking industry and things that we'll talk about a little bit in some context in chapter 20, so far as how it relates to health and nutrition, but also sanitation and safety for the American public. By the time you get to the 1880s and 90s, this is where you begin to see more of this being the farming frontier. There's this talk about like different elements of the frontier economy. The mining frontier is actually first, as they find gold and silver out in different parts of the western states. But by the 1870s, there's the cattle frontier, as the cattle drives and the cattle industry and the cattle boom and business boom starts to happen. But by the 1880s and 90s, much more of the western economy is going to be centrally focused on farming, which gets us into topics like the Grange movement and the farmers' alliances and the Populist Party by the time you get to the 1890s and the economic issues that they're having. So I'm hoping you're kind of picking up that even though we're adding new information into this time period, everything that we're seeing here is interconnected with other things that we've talked about in other chapters, in other topics, other themes of this unit. So as more and more American citizens moved out to the Great Plains, there was going to be an increasing level of conflict that would happen with Native Americans that had been already pushed out into this area because of previous policies by the United States government, and going back to the colonial days, from British policies and even Spanish colonial policies. When we talk about the Native Americans that are on the Great Plains, the term Plains Indians is kind of the way this is usually referred to, like traditionally referred to. But the truth is, the Plains Indians are a conglomeration of different tribes that have been in different parts of what's now the United States and have been pushed there over centuries from interactions and warfare between the United States and British colonials and Spanish colonials. And by the time you get to the late 19th century, this is much more of a nomadic culture, more interested in protecting the viability of their existence through conflict and warfare against the United States as American settlers move into these areas. So far as, I guess previous generations, when the Great Plains didn't really have much of a U.S. population that was there, there's a couple of generations worth of time where this is pretty calm and relaxed so far as their lifestyle is concerned. But as more American settlers move to the west, United States settlers moving west thanks to the Homestead Act and the railroad development and the cattle drive and the farming frontier, you get more and more of a struggle for the resources that are there. One of the primary resources that Native American groups made use of was the buffalo. And you may, if you remember back into a fifth grade U.S. history class, there may have been a lesson where you were taught the different parts of the buffalo used for different pieces. The meat and then the hide. I mean, meat for eating, right? But the hide for clothing and for shelter, and the bones for tools, and the sinew, the ligaments and tendons for making tools and weapons in some cases. And U.S. settlers, knowing the reliance on the buffalo as one of the really only resources available on the Great Plains. Think about that house that we saw on the previous section that was made out of sod from dirt. There's not a lot of resources. There's an effort being made by American settlers to just, well, decimate and remove the buffalo or remove bison from the plains. And so bison herds are going to be hunted to near extinction by American settlers that are out there, and this isn't to make use of them for any kind of real purpose other than for killing. So the picture here is a pile of bison skulls that is kind of a piece of evidence towards the level of effort made in trying to eliminate buffalo from the frontier. In part, anyway, because it was clear that this was going to weaken the Native American viability to resist American settlement and to survive on the Great Plains. Now, while buffalo hunting may have been just a process that happened fairly organically as settlers moved out there, federal policies towards Native Americans are pretty straightforward. That in the 1850s and 60s, the general policy was to continue relocating or concentrating Native American population groups into areas where white settlement was not going to be moving in. You're moving them to make way for white settlers to come into this part of the continent, this part of the country. The problem is going to come into like where you get to the borderlands between where Native American and white American settlements are going to come in contact with each other or come in close proximity with each other. And you can track the development of this through looking at periods of conflict and warfare between U.S. settlers and the U.S. Army. and Native American groups. The first of which we can see going back like still during the Civil War is that the Dakota War, the Dakota Sioux Uprising in 1862. More so on the edge of where white settlers have already coming into a population base here in what's now like I guess southwestern Minnesota. This conflict is going to result in a relocation of Dakota Sioux Indians to other parts of the Great Plains. By the time you get to 1864, there's another incident that takes place in eastern Colorado that is referred to as the Sand Creek Massacre. The Sand Creek Reservation, where the Creek Indians were living at this point, is kind of a desolate area, but there are more American U.S. settlers that are moving in because of discovery of gold mines in the area. And so the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864 happens when Colonel John Chivington and his militia, they're going to raid a village and kill about 400 Indians, men, women, and children, to move them out of the area, even though this land had been protected for the Creek Indians, Sand Creek Indians, by previous treaty. But as Americans begin to move into the area, this part of the country as part of the economic frontier of the West, the conflicts happen and a relocation policy persists. This relocation policy is going to keep continuing, and you get instances like the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. This is now like what is southern Montana. Here, it's a similar story. It is an area where more American settlers are moving in because of gold and silver discoveries in this area, and the U.S. Army is sent in to remove the Sioux Indians that are here. What makes this event notable is going to be the fact that the Sioux are going to defeat the U.S. Army here, and this is sometimes referred to as Custer's Last Stand. You may have heard this term. General George Armstrong Custer is going to lead his men into basically an ambush where they are surrounded, and the bulk of his troops are going to be almost entirely wiped out. 264 of Custer's men are going to be killed, including Custer himself. That's going to happen because they're facing a Sioux army that is about 10 times that size. If we take a closer look at the picture here, this picture gives us a very traditional American view of what's going on, because the Americans don't refer to this as the Battle of Little Bighorn at this point in time. It's called Custer's Last Stand because Custer is here looking brave and resolute in the middle of all the chaos around him, as they are going to his men are going to fight down to the very last individual. A way of romanticizing the efforts that are being made by the U.S. Army here to protect American settlers from the Native Americans on the frontier. And this is going to, even though this is a defeat for the U.S., this is going to lead to a doubling and redoubling of efforts by the U.S. government to send more troops to get better control of things in the West, and ultimately lead to a change of what's going to happen with American, Native American policies when it comes down to moving away from relocation and reconcentration and getting more along the lines into reservations and land acquisition. And this is something that American Yawp refers to as the allotment era, and it's really much more of a story of control and resistance as opposed to settlement and warfare. So like I said, after the Battle of Little Bighorn, there is an increased level of military activity out in the Great Plains. everywhere from Kansas and Nebraska down into Texas, out into Colorado and Montana, and even points further west almost into California. This increased military activity is designed to take all Native Americans and to move them into reservations where the land could, at least in theory, be protected for them, and to keep them out of the way of white settlers as they continue to move in. Some of the soldiers that are out there on the Great Plains are the Buffalo Soldiers. And I know you can pause and you can read the caption here, but the Buffalo Soldiers are African American soldiers that have joined into the army in the years after the Civil War, and as a way of trying to maintain some segregation in the military, and as a way to try to maintain some unity in parts of the military, African American soldiers are placed in segregated units, and by and large, they're sent out to the Great Plains to kind of monitor and patrol and to get control of the Great Plains from Native Americans. This increased activity is going to lead to more and more Native Americans being corralled, if you will. It's kind of an inhumane term, but they're trying to gather them up and put them into reservation lands. And so individuals like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, members of the Sioux Nation up in the north central United States, or Geronimo, who is an Apache leader in the American Southwest, or we see here Red Cloud and American Horse from the Oglala tribe. This is really an element of trying to encourage, when encouragement doesn't work, to force Native American leaders to surrender and survive in order to, by moving to these reservations. And this reservation policy is going to be the law of the land, really going up into the next, 50 years or more. The law that makes this allotment policy the official law of the land in the United States is the Dawes Act. There's the Dawes Severalty Act in 1887. It's an allotment act. It is going to give an allotment of land to different tribes, and it's going to essentially set up an Indian reservation policy that's there. As I'll get the word allotment on here because this is actually what we're talking about. This is going to remove tribal ownership of land and make it more of an individual ownership of land, which kind of cuts against most of the general culture of Native American beliefs in property ownership. There's not necessarily a belief in private property ownership by them. It's more of a community or a communal or a tribal ownership of land. But the transition of this over towards private property ownership and a dependence on an increasing American economy that's coming in, this is going to lead a lot of Native Americans to be forced to sell their land. And so flyers like this are circulated. This is dated 1911, but this is fairly common so far as pushing individual Native Americans into selling land that they had no other choice if they were going to gain any kind of monetary development out of this, because the dependence on an American money-based economy is going to force the issue here. And the result of this is going to be somewhere around 2/3 of tribal land in the United States is going to be sold off in a slow, steady, sure process. And we can see this if we look specifically at the Great Sioux Reservation. This is South Dakota. So it's like if you think about the U.S. map where we are here, this is South Dakota, there's North Dakota, and Minnesota, Iowa, and Nebraska on the other sides. So this is how the reservation how it appeared in 1868. And then as we move ahead into 1877, even before the Dawes Act makes this official policy, you see some shrinking of this reservation land taking place. And as we move ahead to 1889, just a couple of years after the Dawes Act, the land here that's owned by the Sioux, it is just shrinking down further and further and further. On the reservations themselves, there is a process of assimilation that is going on. And we saw this term when we talked about immigrants moving into northeastern cities, this acculturation or this blending in and this reteaching on how to be a right, proper American citizen and part of the American culture. And so through this development, they actually build assimilation schools in states further to the east where Native Americans are going to be sent and be taught how to be, normalized, assimilated, proper Americans. And so this was what we saw. We saw a picture back on the opening title for this section. And here's this picture one more time. So this is two pictures of the same person. His name is Tom Torlino. He's a member of the Navajo Nation, and he entered as a student at the Carlisle Indian School. And this is back further to the east. The Carlisle School was founded by the government, U.S. government, in 1879, and it really had a sole purpose of trying to Americanize and normalize Native Americans into a U.S. culture. And so one of the ways they publicized the work they were doing there was to take these pictures, a before and after picture, photo taken on the first day that students would enter the school, and then after a haircut and a change of clothes and a period of schooling, there the second picture is taken to show the progress of the day. One of the realities of the Carlisle School is that there's a widespread amount of abuse and disease and death that's associated with these places, but that's not really publicized. That there is a real attention being paid to uh, what the public message is going to be about what's happening here, because this is seen as doing the right kind of work to help the United States prosper here in the late 19th century. So, as you might expect, there is a great deal of resistance still from the Native American community. And this resistance is best symbolized with this development called the ghost dance movement. It is a kind of a culture ritual where Native Americans, the Sioux in particular, were calling for the return of the buffalo and the return of their ancestors to come back and to deliver them out of the oppression and out of the reservations and out of the difficult times that were there. And as while I don't really believe that this is something where they was necessarily a thought that the dead were going to rise from the grave and have some sort of mystical overthrow. To me, this seems just more like a callback to prior generations and the good old days of a nostalgic way of thinking where there was just less pain and suffering that's going on there. But what the white settlers, what the U.S. Army is hearing on this, is that there is some level of a call for action, a call for war that comes out of this. And while where this is centered in South Dakota on the Sioux on the Sioux Nation, on the Sioux land, at Wounded Knee, South Dakota, the unfortunate turn of events is during one of these ghost dance rituals. Really unfortunate turn of events. During one of these ghost dance rituals, there is a shot is fired, and by the time that everything is cleared, there's 300 Sioux men, women, and children that are killed by the U.S. Army. And the photo that we've got here, the photo in the aftermath of this is showing Native Americans being put into a mass grave as a way of just sort of reasserting American military control of the plains. The reality about this situation is that this is the last armed conflict between any Native American tribe and the United States Army, period. It's the end of the military conflict in the West known as the Great Plains Wars. It is the beginning of the next phase of what's going into Native American history, which is a period of allotment and still some level of resistance, but more a question of survival, if not of Native Americans themselves, but trying to also find a way for Native American culture to survive as it moves into the 20th century. And we will see a lot of U.S. history classes like this one kind of get to this point, and then Native American history really just doesn't persist as a topic once you move into the 20th century. So we'll see what we can do a little bit later on this semester to keep this story moving forward. For mainstream American society and mainstream American culture, the way that the West is thought about really has a parallel development. There is a question of what the real history is for the West. And a lot of that question has to do with the development of the mythic West. And so this is where this last section, really, I guess, is the last couple of sections of the chapter get into when it comes down to how Americans, well, even American history classes, think about the West and its role in American history. And while we will have talked about Frederick Jackson Turner and the Turner Frontier thesis when we're looking at American expansion, we need to look at it here briefly as well. Frederick Jackson Turner is really kind of focused in on like the story of the American West, and his history essay, published in 1893 about the significance of the frontier, it kind of lends itself to an element of romanticizing the West, not in paying attention to like a Native American culture and the diversity of a Native American culture, but how it's going to promote a mainstream United States perception of what the West really was, or what they felt it really was. The closing of the frontier feels like the end of an era in a lot of ways, and so there's a real attention being paid to what that actually means, and trying to pay homage in a lot of ways to where the West, how the West was won, and how the West is going to be a defining element of what it means to be an American. So it's important to think about Turner in this kind of context. I think for the bulk of American citizens, the way they would think about the West is going to be the Wild West and Wild West shows. At the beginning of the section, and we saw it, in another chapter, that poster that's there for Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. I mean, this is kind of a glorified circus that's kind of got a Western theme to it. And in this, Buffalo Bill is a real person, a real buffalo hunter that is going to also have an element of showman about himself. And this Wild West circus is going to tour the eastern United States and tour Europe and kind of show a very clean, sanitized, cooperative version of what the West was like. And so you can see Buffalo Bill is here in the middle of this. This is a little bit later in life. I think this picture is actually taken while they're touring in Italy. But they've got Native Americans that are in full cultural dress that are really kind of representing what appears to be a calm, peaceful, Wild West kind of transition to a great American culture developing there. Kind of taking away some of the brutal aspects of it, for sure, taking away the brutal aspects of it, but kind of presenting a very clean, sanitized, and white American persona with this. There are about 30% of cowboys in the Western Plains that were African American, but that you don't really see that in things like the Wild West show, because that wouldn't be a logical depiction to get out of late 19th century America, where a value of white American Protestant culture is the winning culture in a social Darwinist kind of way of thinking. The Wild West shows did include people like Annie Oakley, who is a real person, a real sharpshooter that was out in the Western Plains. But as the frontier closes, her skills are going to be much more suited to things in a circus and a show that's going to tour and kind of transition the West from being part of the reality of American culture to being a perception of how it plays into Western culture. We've had a couple of references in class to the beginning of the movie era, but one of the first wave of movies that come out are going to be things that are going to be, well, that's just they're westerns. And so while on the two pictures here, I'm definitely jumping ahead on the time frame because this is John Wayne and Clint Eastwood, and two of the biggest western movie stars, going from, like, for John Wayne it's in the 1940s and 50s, and for Eastwood it's in the 1960s. The western is, for as far as western movies are concerned, it is a dominant genre that was maybe the dominant genre of American movie going up until the 1950s. And since then, westerns have kind of faded out, but every now and then they come back trying to retell what's happening in the West from a different perspective. But for the better part of a century on this, the American perception of the West and the American reputation for the West and the American myth of the West is that it was a peaceful transition as white American civilization would take things over. But one of the reasons to study history in this kind of depth is to get past what the mainstream view is and to look at this from a variety of different perspectives, which is something that we'll try to do as we are looking forward into other chapters for this unit and into subsequent units.